Ian, you're running for state senate in District 10.
That's right.
This is actually the first election in quite a while in which libertarians have had major party status in New Hampshire.
20 years.
Yeah.
22 years.
So some people might be a little bit unfamiliar with the canon of libertarianism. And maybe you can start out by explaining a little bit of what your view is of libertarianism and how it maybe differs from just general traditional New Hampshire independence.
Well, I don't know if it differs from New Hampshire independence. A lot of New Hampshire natives I run into are pretty freedom-friendly, freedom-minded people. The libertarians are people who believe that you should be free to live your life how you want, so long as you don't cause harm to another human being. Or another way of putting that is what they call the non-aggression principle, where it's not okay to use the threat of violence against our neighbors. This is basic kind of preschool level stuff. But what the state, the idea of the state or the government as we know it, allows people to do is to use the violence of the state against their neighbors. And they don't necessarily see it that way because there's all these kind of structures that are built up to kind of distract people from the violence sort of inherent in the system. So libertarians just say, hey, it's not okay to threaten your neighbor. It's not okay to use threats of violence or actual violence to get your way. If you've got a good idea, then you should be able to implement it with consent. You should be able to implement it voluntarily without having to threaten your neighbors. And that's ultimately what happens when somebody gets in control of the government, whether it be Republicans or Democrats. They usually wield the sort of the violence of the state against the other party, against other people. So we're seeing that now, like with the Kavanaugh hearings, where people feel like they're being violated by this guy being put in, and they are. People are constantly violated by the government and at all levels, federal, state, and local. So I hope that answers your question. Libertarians are against violence, aggressive violence. We're okay with defensive violence. So if somebody attacks you, your loved ones, your family, you have the right to defend them and defend yourself.
When you say that the people are being violated by the Kavanaugh hearings, in what way do you mean that?
Well, it's being forced upon them. I saw a post on the internet recently by somebody who was upset that he was approved, and they felt like they were it was their feeling as though they were being violated by this whole decision, that they weren't listened to, that they said no, they didn't want him, but yet they got him anyway. And so that's what government does, is they shove their way down the throat of individuals who don't want it. Now those people will probably try to redouble their efforts next time, get their people elected, and then shove their candidates down, or their court people, judges down others' throats. And it's very uncomfortable, and it's very upsetting when somebody forces their way upon you, and that's what's happening.
Okay, so regardless of people on either side who might have agreed or disagreed on whether he should be on the court, there is a process there. It appears you're saying, well, it doesn't matter which side you're on, that process is flawed.
The whole thing's flawed.
So how would you then make judicial appointments? Or any appointments?
I have no love whatsoever for the federal government at all, but if we were talking about on the state level, ultimately, if you take the idea of, hey, let's not institutionalize violence down to its logical extreme, that means that the entire structure of the idea of the state would have to change, because the state at its base level is a violent organization. Barack Obama famously or infamously said during his term that the state has a monopoly on violence, and that's exactly what is the truth. And when I say the state, I don't mean the state of New Hampshire. I mean just sort of the idea, the general concept of whether we're talking about the federal government, state government, local government, the state as a concept that justifies strangers using violence to get their way against people. So we're talking about a fundamental change in how human beings interact here, and the idea of rejecting, in the long run, the idea of being coercive towards one another.
You use this word, violence, and as you said a few minutes ago, people don't necessarily see it that way, and I think a lot of people wouldn't call state actions at. So when you talk about, the state engaging in violence or the threat of violence, could you just give a few examples
Sure.
of what you mean by that?
Everything the state does is backed by the threat of violence. Because if you don't do what they tell you to do, or you do what they tell you not to do, then eventually, they'll probably send you a letter first. It'll be a threatening letter. And if you don't listen to the threatening letter, eventually men with guns will probably show up at your door and they will do something to you. They might try to take you into custody and lock you into a cage, or if you don't want to go with them voluntarily, then they'll hurt you. So behind every government program, whether it's as simple as not pulling over for a police officer trying to pull you over, and that escalates to them running you off the road and throwing you out of the car, or to not paying property taxes, or to opening up a business without a permit, opening up a business without asking the government's permission to do that, which of course seems contradictory in a so-called free country, but I don't think anybody would claim that this is a free country anymore.
So if you are able to get elected to the state senate, and in your role as a state senator, where would you take this? Does this mean a constitutional convention or a whole lot of constitutional amendments to radically change the New Hampshire Constitution?
So the New Hampshire Constitution, on the scale of constitutions, is a pretty decent one. The first thing that I would like to focus on as far as changing fundamentals would be to get New Hampshire out of the United States in the first place. Having that bureaucracy, having those people over our heads doesn't benefit us at all. They just take obedience, they take money, and they take as much of it as they can possibly get. It doesn't matter whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump or George Bush who's running that particular organization. It's going to make us poorer as a result of that. It puts us in greater danger as a result of its warmongering around the globe. So to disconnect from that would be good. And then to take the current state as is, the state of New Hampshire, and turn it into a consensual organization would just simply require them to stop using violence against people, to make taxes voluntary, essentially. Make it so that you can fund the agencies that you value. And if you don't value one of their agencies, let's say I have a disagreement with the police. Maybe I think they're too violent, they're going after peaceful people, they're arresting college students, who haven't hurt anybody else for walking from one house to another with a beer in their hand or something like this, which happens every weekend here in Keene. So let's say I'm upset about that and I want to defund the police department. In today's world, if I do that, the very same cops are going to show up and throw me out of my house if I don't pay property taxes. But if I could say, oh, well, I want to fund the roads, I want to fund the snow removal, I want to fund leaf pickup, but I don't want to fund the police until they stop hurting peaceful people, I can't make that choice. And choices are what freedom's really all about, the ability to say no to somebody.
And so as a practical matter, if you were able to bring about the removal of New Hampshire from the federal union, how would such things as, say, defense be provided for? Would we contract with the federal government for that, or?
I would hope not.
But so Russia's going to bomb us or something. How would New Hampshire deal with that?
It seems unlikely that Russia would want to bomb us.
True, but maybe
we can look at countries in the world that
Maybe
don't.
Canada. They're right there.
They could. New Hampshire's a well-armed state.
In the Lakes region, and they want to invade. Or something.
So New Hampshire's a very well-armed state. It is one of the most free places when it comes to gun freedom. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of people who are willing to defend their own property here, and I would say those people could come together in whatever sort of voluntary order that they wished to defend their property.
But there's a difference between the way people are armed to defend their property, and armed the way a government is armed to defend its borders.
Sure.
The scale of the technology and the weaponry is vastly different. It seems, I mean, there's all props to the American Revolution and the ragged band of patriots. Mm-hmm. It seems unlikely nowadays, with the advancement of weaponry, that there's people who have guns for their personal protection are going to be able to ward off.
You'd think, but
power.
A ragtag group of insurgents in Afghanistan's managed to ward off foreign powers in the case of both Russia and the United States fairly effectively. living out of caves with nothing more than machine guns and RPGs and maybe some improvised explosive devices. So I don't think that's very likely what you're talking about, an invasion. I mean, there are other countries in the world that don't have militaries, like Costa Rica. Now, you could argue that the United States probably has some sort of an agreement to come to their aid, but ultimately I think that New Hampshire can take care of itself pretty well. And if you want to buy fancier weapons, then raise the money voluntarily to do that.
The voluntary tax system you described, one way I could see it going is what you talked about. People value roads. They're going to pay for roads voluntarily. Another way I could see it going is people say, oh, I don't have to pay for anything. Someone will pay for roads, but I'm just not going to put any money in, and then you have the tragedy of the commons and all that. How do you address that?
That would be the free rider.
Free rider,
concern. But tragedy of the commons is where everybody owns a thing, but then nobody gets to control that thing. The free riders, of course, are going to be inevitable. There's going to be some grumpy old guy, down the street who doesn't want to help with anything, and you know what? That's fine. The good news is when things are done consensually, when funds are being raised voluntarily, say by a charity or this new government that we've never seen before that actually runs things consensually, they actually have to provide some level of accountability. They have to provide some level of service beyond what the sort of minimums that they do now. They're accountable today, but only every 2 years, and only by the system that they've created to where certain people can run for office and get in. And as we've seen with politicians, very little changes through that particular system. The government, the state, historically has always been inefficient. And the reason why is because if you could get in, let's say, whatever the budget of the newspaper is, times 2 every single year without ever having to worry about a single subscriber leaving, well, why wouldn't you, right? I mean, you wouldn't have to do the greatest reporting at that point because your subscribers were guaranteed. And the same thing's true with the government. They don't have to do the best, because their money is guaranteed next year. If they don't do that great, well, they can actually come back and say, well, we need more money because we couldn't do the job well enough. So every year, government continues to get funded regardless of its performance. Whereas if you had the opportunity to say no, in the same way that you can say no to Walmart, you can say no to Target, you can say no and not shop at these stores, for instance, for whatever reason you don't like them. You can make that choice. You can't choose that with government. So it doesn't have the incentives to really be on its best behavior, to really be efficient with its funds.
If you say no to subscribing to us, you don't get the paper. You
Right.
only get 5 free articles online or whatever it is. Presumably, if you said no to funding roads, you'd still get to use the roads, or is there some sort of...
You would still, again, if you wanted to get a little bit further, deeper into the idea of changing over the government monopoly services to, let's say, more market-based services, where roads could be privately owned, roads could be sponsored. There's all kinds of other ways maybe to fund roads. Maybe the businesses on the roads could pay for the maintenance on those roads because they want people to come to their businesses. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be organized in the same way that it currently is. And I don't claim to know the way, things would end up if they were actually funded on a consensual basis. But there's a good chance that more innovation would happen in the areas of, funding things.
Well, on the assumption that at least within the first 2 years of your tenure in the Senate, you might not be able to get New Hampshire to withdraw from the Union.
Probably not. No.
What would
It's
your
gonna take some
legislative priorities during those 2 years be?
I would like to see an end to prohibition. That's one of my main pushes, to end all prohibitions that involve consensual activities. So drug prohibition is the obvious one that's causing the biggest problems. Obviously there's the opioid crisis going on, and arguably that exists in the way that it does because of drug prohibition. This is something that we should have learned 100 years ago with alcohol prohibition, when that didn't work, when it drove all of the activity underground, made the product more dangerous, bathtub gin, and people going blind and things like that. Brought about these criminal gangs that were fighting in the streets, crossfire, innocents dying. We're seeing all of the same things today. Not a whole lot of it happens in Keene, at least on the drive-by shooting level, thank goodness. But we're certainly seeing the aspects of people dying because they're using products that are being manufactured in questionable circumstances. in back sheds or wherever it is that these things are manufactured by whoever it is that's manufacturing them. Whereas if they were legal and you could purchase your heroin like you used to be able to more than 100 years ago in the United States, if you could just go and buy some of it, then you would be able to actually get a medical grade product that's actually manufactured in a controlled environment, to where in the same way that when you're buying a bottle of aspirin, you know exactly what the dosage is. Most overdoses happen because people don't know what they're getting. They don't know the difference between one batch of heroin and the next, and one batch could be 10 times more, strong than the next one, and if they take what they think is the same dose, they end up dead. And so it's drug prohibition that has created these circumstances where things are worse than they would normally be. And further, it exacerbates them. So if you take somebody who's got a drug addiction, lock them up in a jail cell, well, they just lost their job because now they're not showing up to work. Good chance they're going to lose their apartment. So by the time they get out of the jail cell, now they have nothing to go back to, especially if they don't have any family that can, pick them up, give them a couch to crash on or something like that. So it's making people's lives worse to use this force against them.
And I think maybe it's Portugal that has a similar approach to this right now, but
they have drug decriminalization for personal amounts, and it's worked very, very well. It's over the last 15 years, it has reduced addiction, and not because the addicts are dying, because they were afraid to get help. Now they're not, because they're not worried about getting turned into the police, and they're actually able to get help.
We're just probing a bit on your general approach of less government is better. Wouldn't, in order to assure that legalized drugs are safe, doesn't there need to be some level of government oversight of those drugs to assure quality, shall we say?
Well, regulation is one of the great myths of government, the idea that regulators are going to protect the consumer. That's what they would like you to believe.
Or sort of maybe more broader question, how does the consumer get protected in your approach to this?
Through market competition and certification. So in the same way that there are standards, just to switch slightly on regulation, with, let's say, health codes with restaurants. Many restaurants have certification standards that are much higher than what the government requires. Why is that? Well, they don't want their customers to get sick. They want them to come back. They want a clean environment, because that's what you want to provide your customer. Same thing's true with drugs. You want to provide a product that is clean, that is pure, that is exactly what it is that the customer is expecting to receive. And so further, if your vendors, so like Walmart or CVS or whoever it is that might be selling these things, they also want to make sure. So they're an extra check on those companies. They want to make sure that your product is good, which is why Walmart and Target, the people that do whatever deals with, let's say, Black & Decker, the manufacturers and the vendors, they want to make sure that toaster's got a UL certification on it. And we've all seen UL. Maybe we don't know what it means. It stands for Underwriters Laboratories, and it's a group that is a private group that certifies the electrical quality of devices. So if you don't have UL certification on your toaster, you're not getting on the shelves at Walmart. So there's different levels of certification and approvals that already exist in the marketplace, and those would be true with medicines as well.
So,
and if I may add, and you wouldn't have the problem with regulatory capture, which is again the sort of the myth of regulation, is that they're there to protect the consumer, but the reality, of course, is that guess who gets in charge of the FDA board? It's the pharmaceutical company, retired CEO who comes in, and he gets on the board. And what's he going to do? Well, he's going to be looking out for his buddies in the pharmaceutical industry and make it difficult for startups or smaller organizations to come up in that world. And that's what they really create regulations for, is to lift the bar above the heads of smaller people who would otherwise be able to compete. Sorry.
Sure, and we'll go. Originally, I think Tom's question was legislative priorities. So one is
end prohibition.
End prohibition,
and that includes on prostitution, gambling, anything that involves consenting people.
Okay, so while we're on the drug topic, though, so you do away with some drug laws, all drug laws.
I can't think of any that should stay.
Okay, so do you want your Uber driver to be driving you while high? You
That's
want to get on an
already against the
airplane?
rules.
Huh?
So that's already against the rules. If you're an Uber driver, you're not allowed to drive drunk or high or anything like that. And alcohol, of course, is completely illegal, but you're not allowed to do that as an Uber driver. And similarly, as an airline pilot, you're also not allowed to do that.
Okay, so
If
you
do
leave that to the companies to enforce that.
as they should, yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, that's a liability issue, and they should absolutely be held liable for any kind of actions that they take that hurt people.
Okay. So what about people who are just driving on their own, but they're out in the road, and they pose a threat?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with the idea of getting somebody who's a danger to others off of the roads.
Through what means?
So if we're talking about a completely voluntary society, which we're not really talking about here, so there's like the difference between the libertarian ideal and then what we have and reducing the government that we currently have. So I don't think most people would disagree that if we're going to have a government police force that's sort of this one-size-fits-all government-funded police force, that one of the things they should be doing is making sure that dangerous people aren't driving on the roads. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Absent a government monopoly over road control, then private road owners would have to come up with ways to remove drivers that weren't wanted on their roads.
And when you say prohibitions involving other consenting activities, does that also include age of consent laws?
I would say so, yeah. I think that all individuals should be free to make decisions for themselves, including the decision to emancipate themselves from their parents, if they feel like that's something they're ready for.
And would that be changing it to, change the age, or completely repealing those sorts of laws?
So I would say repeal it completely, because all of it is just an arbitrary decision. In some states, there's such a thing as an emancipation law. It doesn't exist in New Hampshire, to what I understand. In Florida, young people can emancipate themselves from their parents at 16, the last I checked. And most young people aren't going to be ready for that, but if somebody decides they want to strike out on their own, they're already working or whatever, and they want to be able to emancipate themselves, and I don't see what the problem is with that. And it's a way for young people who are living in abusive households to get out of those households, instead of, say, trying to run away from those households and then having the police forcibly return them to an abusive set of parents, which does happen.
Do you worry at all about a capacity issue? So if there are no restrictions at all, say, I can remember my kids saying at probably age 4 that I was the worst person in the world, and they're going to leave me. So should they have been free to make that decision and go away, in your view? Or and there are existing laws on capacity to contract, for instance. So are there standards that, in your view, should apply to those kinds of
I think community standards, what is acceptable by neighbors and friends, and obviously if some kid shows up and knocks on the door here wanting a factory job here in the printing press, you're going to say no.
Yeah.
Each individual owner of a business can decide these things. So opening a bank account, for instance, banks can make a decision. Do we want to allow 16-year-olds to open a bank account? Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. I think it's all up to
But
the
if
interlocking parts of society.
If they decide to, is there a worry that an unscrupulous bank might be taking advantage of the child?
I suppose some people could worry about that. Buyer beware, caveat emptor. Make sure that you know what you're
The buyer
doing.
is an underage child here, so in this hypothetical. But
Yeah, underage and child are two different concepts, but I don't consider a 16-year-old to be a child, even though the government does. And actually, by my reading of the banking regulations in New Hampshire, it does seem like banks could decide to allow young people to open up their own accounts if they wanted to. So, again, let the businesses decide these things. Let organizations provide advice to people and offer protection. So,
In promotional video that you produce, or you put forth, I think Cheshire TV may have been running it. You say you're not taking donations specifically to
Correct.
you because this is an informational campaign, primarily. Now, accepting that anybody who runs for office would like to win and get that office. When you say it's primarily informational, is that geared toward an expectation that you won't win, that, hey, I want to use this platform to get the message out, but really I don't expect that I'm going to be able to overcome the basic advantages that the Democratic and Republican candidates have? Or?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have advantages. People can vote for a straight ticket, and that's, that obviously helps the major parties.
Yeah.
For me,
But you're a major party now.
technically, and we'll see if they can retain that. They Libertarians have to get above 4% in a
Right.
state election. So governor this year has to get 4%. So Gilletta Jarvis, if she doesn't get 4%, the Libertarians will be back down to minor party status. But for me, political campaigns are always just a way to get the message of freedom and the non-aggression principle and explain to people what it means to, to apply that principle to the government. To me, I don't really care whether or not I do get elected, because ultimately I probably couldn't swear the oath of office anyway, even if I did. So.
Why not?
There's an oath that every office holder has to take in New Hampshire, and it swears an oath of allegiance to the United States, which I couldn't possibly do. Number one, even if I could swear an oath of allegiance to the state of New Hampshire, which I would probably not be able to do that either. I take oaths pretty seriously, so I definitely have no allegiance to the United States, so I wouldn't possibly be able to swear an oath to it, and I don't think it would be fair to cross my fingers and do it either. So, if I could swear an oath to freedom, and doing what's right for liberty, then I would do that. But I don't think the state will accept that.
Question for the clerk's office, maybe.
But even so, if I were to get elected and then refuse to take the oath, unless they filled the office with some appointee, we'd still actually be better off with no state senator than the current state senator that we have.
So you've run for a couple different. You've run for House. You've run for City Council. You've run for governor.
That's right. As a Democrat.
This time you chose state senator. So how do you see that job? What does state senator entail to you? Oath aside, assuming you had that position, how do you see moving forward in that?
Well, I mean, you would do what senators do, which is to say similar things as the state reps do, which is putting in pieces of legislation, working on the ones that are submitted, and changing them for the better, hopefully, and then passing the better ones. I mean, I've seen the process. I know what it is. I've spent a lot of time in Concord at the State House reporting and recording video of state senators doing things. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
So in terms of your ideology, as you were looking at legislation that was before the committee you were on, or as in a general vote, would you be looking at it at each piece in terms of, okay, does this forward the libertarian, I'm going to use the word agenda, but not in a
sure.
loaded way.
Yeah, I would say that's
you
true.
say, okay, this is an incremental step, so that's better than not getting a step, I'm
Yes.
going to vote for that? Or would
Yeah.
you say, well, if this doesn't meet my personal standards of what I think it ought to be, I'm just going to
Generally,
voting against everything?
so if there is an incremental step that can get towards more freedom, then I support taking those steps.
Okay.
Sometimes you kind of have to hold your nose into it, from what I've seen with some of these pieces of legislation out there. And of course, there are a couple dozen pretty freedom-friendly state representatives out there that have been doing this kind of job. There's the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance that actually does they kind of review. They try for all of the bills. It's obviously a big task, but they try to review as many of the bills every single year as possible and give a kind of a recommendation for state reps and state senators as to, if you were a liberty-minded person, this is how you would vote on this bill. So New Hampshire is one of the unique, I think it's the only place that has this, where state senators and reps will receive voting recommendations from their party. So like the Democrats and Republicans will give them a recommendation. And here they also get from the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance recommendations there. So that's actually nice, because it means I wouldn't have to do a whole lot more of the research, and I could rely on them because I'm a supporter of that organization. They do good work.
So there are only so many libertarians in District 10. What do you think appeals to Democratic voters over Jay Kahn, and how do you think you appeal to Republicans over Dan LeClaire?
I'm not so really concerned with Democrats and Republicans. Most voters, or the plurality of them in New Hampshire, are undeclareds.
Okay, well,
so
party, but sort of more left-leaning or more right-leaning?
I don't know if everybody describes themselves in that way, but you could say that, you know, people on the right, and these are major generalizations here, right? It's not true on the individual level, but people on the right might have a greater appreciation for economic freedom. People on the left might have a greater appreciation for personal freedoms. So perhaps the message of ending drug prohibition, depending on who you're talking to, you know, you can say it different ways that might appeal to different groups. So drug prohibition is good for economics because it takes money and leaves it in the hands of the people rather than giving it to all this pointless drug enforcement that has just been, you know, a tremendous waste of money, the money that's wasted putting these people in jail cells and prison cells. So there's a huge economic burden that's created by drug prohibition. And then, of course, if you're talking to somebody on the left, then you would explain that drug prohibition infringes on your freedom to do what you want with your own body, and that all on its own is a tragedy and needs to be ended. So it just depends on, you know, if I know who I'm talking to, I can try to paint a picture that explains liberty to that person in a way that they can better understand. I don't know if that answered your question.
Sure.
Okay.
And speaking of drug prohibition, you know, aside from legalizing these drugs, are there other steps you as a legislator would take to address the opioid crisis?
So, to make the drugs legal, of course, will make them, you know, consistent in their quality, as I explained before. That pretty much is going to end the unintentional overdoses. If somebody intends to overdose, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, they can go and swallow a bottle of aspirin today if they want to overdose. You're going to let people out of prison who, you know, because that should go along with pardoning, right? So if you're going to legalize these drugs, you should say, oh, we shouldn't have put you people in prison. Okay, if you didn't hurt anybody, you know, if you didn't, you know, rob a convenience store or something like that, if you were just a drug user or a drug dealer, you should be let back out so you can add to the productive economy, so you can be there to create a product or service rather than just sitting in a prison cell sucking up the state's resources. So those would be two things that you could immediately do to have a dramatic effect on things. As far as treating people, because here in New Hampshire, as you probably know, we of course now have Narcan, which was an end of a prohibition. There was a prohibition against having Narcan previously. Now people can have it, and you know what? Lives are being saved because of that. So making it so that, you know, once again, there's no risk to somebody for being a drug user and coming out and talking to a doctor about that. The fear factor around being known about that sort of thing will go away. And as we've seen in Portugal, it's likely that drug abuse will go down. If other drugs are also legal, like cannabis, we've definitely seen testimony from people who had been addicted to opiates who've used cannabis to get off of their opiates. I know personally people who've done that. A former roommate of mine from Florida called it the marijuana maintenance program, and he had been crushing up, I think it was oxycodones and injecting that, and smoked marijuana to completely rid himself of the opiate habit without even really having any kind of doctor's support or anything like that. It's just something he did on his own. So having drugs like cannabis being more available will remediate people's desire to use, in some cases, the hard drugs. Now, obviously, there's no way to truly end the tragedy of drug addiction, but having a legal circumstance will make it so those people are more likely to get help that's actually valuable to them.
And in terms of making sure that help is actually there when they want it, does the state have a role in funding treatment or kind of making sure it's available?
Well, the state is violence, so no. Any kind of treatment should be done consensually. Any kind of funding of a treatment center should be done consensually. Again, if your idea is a good idea, then it should be able to be done without the use of the state's violence behind it. So the hallmark of a bad idea is that you have to threaten somebody to go along with it. And that's ultimately what the state does, is it threatens people.
So a treatment center would need to be funded through donations or
however else they could.
Revenues or whatever.
Exactly. Right, they could run their own business and or collect donations, have different methods of funding. And once again, If there's some guy down the street who doesn't care and doesn't want to contribute, that's fine, because when contributions are voluntary, when the organization is working to make their contributors happy, they're going to be more efficient. So the money that's spent by a private organization is always probably multiple times more efficient than whatever equivalent there might be in the government, because the government's guaranteed the funding every single year, whereas the organization has to prove they're doing a good job. They have to satisfy their contributors in order to get them to contribute the next year.
And if that's still not enough, if people are donating, but centers are using these funds.
See, I believe in
efficiently.
people, and ultimately the fear that you're bringing up here is that, well, it may not be enough. What if it's not? What if it's not enough? We can see that people are very generous, even generous to the point of helping people they've never met before. So it's one thing when a house burns down across Keene, people know that person, likely, or you're usually no more than 1 degree separated from somebody who knew that person here. If it's a typhoon or some terrible natural disaster in Taiwan or something like that, we still saw Americans donating billions of dollars to the Red Cross and other organizations that helped out in those circumstances. And probably most people donating didn't have family or didn't have somebody that they knew that was living over there. So I see humans being generally good, and I see humans as being generally generous. So I don't worry about those sorts of things. And the fear that they might not isn't enough justification for me to embrace the idea of using violence to get my way.
So obviously a big part of your platform is make taxes voluntary, which I'm guessing, along with downsizing the government, would mean you would need less of a state budget. But there still would be a budget. I mean, there are some things that if the state had a role, you would have to fund. Are there ways that, other than voluntary taxes, that you would see generating revenue toward the state?
Well, if they were all of a sudden voluntary, like if they could actually do that and we actually had that system that we're talking about where people would contribute consensually to whatever activities and budgets of state bureaucracy, then you'd see them getting creative, I think, because then they would have the incentive to make sure that they had other funding methods in place, whether that be, again, I don't know what it would look like because necessity is the mother of invention, but it could be, advertising on, like I said, for roads, for instance, billboards or some kind of sponsorships that would help with that. This road brought to you by Toyota or whatever. So I don't know what it would end up looking like, but people who cannot use violence to get their way, well, maybe they'll get creative and come up with something.
One of the things that you would end a prohibition on is gambling.
Certainly. Seems like an obvious one.
What do you think about the idea of having casinos in New Hampshire? Is that...
We already have them. There's one
Yeah.
called the Keene Casino, and it's a few blocks away from here. So the difference being that the state mandates that a certain portion of their revenues goes towards nonprofit groups,
Right.
but there's still gambling in New Hampshire,
Oh, yeah.
and that's okay. I'm not a gambler. I mean, I'm not somebody who wants to go out and gamble. I've never been to Vegas. Never been to Atlantic City. But I think people should be free to do what they want with the things that are theirs. And we certainly understand that some people go too far and they'll mortgage their home and do all kinds of things they shouldn't do to feed a gambling addiction.
So what do you do about people like that? You just say, yeah, sorry you had this problem.
Well, you offer people help. The addicts who aren't ready for help are not going to appreciate help. So, whether it's a drug
Who
addict,
offers help?
Whatever gambling addiction hotline or organizations that there are or would be in that circumstance, local churches, whoever it is that wants to help take care of those folks and educate them or encourage them to change their behavior. But if you force somebody to get help, then it's very rare that that actually works. So if you've got a drug addiction clinic and you force people to go to it, well, that actually makes it worse for the people who've chosen to go there, because the people that want help don't need to be around people that have been forced into a system that they didn't appreciate. So sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you're going to be able to, say, yes, I'm ready for help.
One issue that's often talked about in the state is not enough young adults moving here, a lot of young adults moving away. Any thoughts on how you would address that as a lawmaker?
So I wouldn't want to be a lawmaker. I'd be want to remove laws, but the laws are the reasons why. I mean, the state, you look at Keene, it's a very high tax place. It's no surprise that a young family is going to move outside of Keene or leave, the region entirely, because it's expensive to live here. And, if you're a retiree and you got plenty of money, then no big deal. Go ahead and cut the checks. But it's expensive. The property taxes here are outrageous, and they're going to pay, the bulk of them, to pay for the government schools, which of course are, I think in Keene, like 60% at least of any given tax bill. So it's because of all that waste that I talked about earlier. When you're guaranteed to get a budget, you don't really care what you do with it. I mean, yeah, there's an election every few years to elect new people to this board, but the ability they have to significantly change the way the system works is very, very, small. And so when you have a more efficient system, which you would have in a voluntary education system or whatever other government bureaucracies we're talking about here, the prices and the costs would go down. And if the taxes were voluntary as well, then obviously people could pay what they could afford. People could pay what bureaucracies they thought were useful, and that may result in more people wanting to stick around if they didn't feel like they were being pushed out by the inability to be able to pay the property taxes here.
In New Hampshire and New England in general has among the highest energy costs in the country. What do you think needs to happen for that to change, or is there anything that the legislature can do to affect that?
Yeah, so this is one I haven't taken a close look at, but I agree with you, New Hampshire, and I've definitely seen that New Hampshire is one of the highest energy cost places. I would say the general principle of decentralization would help. In a lot of places in New Hampshire, to some extent, this is true. You don't get a choice as far as who's going to provide you with power. You do have the choice of being able to kind of self-generate your power, so you can install solar panels and do other things to remediate being fully reliant on the power grid. But if there was more decentralization, and New Hampshire had I think a little bit of that several years ago when it deregulated the ability. What is it? There's the supplier of power, and then there's the delivery distributor. Yeah. So they deregulated one side to where you can choose, I believe, the supplier, and that did seem to lower rates a little bit because they were competing on rate at that point. So as we know, competition, fundamentally does provide for better service. It does provide for lower prices, innovation. And so having more choices in the marketplace, I think, would help with that.
One place where the marketplace so far hasn't really seemed to get it done is pollution, and especially climate change. So I'm wondering, do you see kind of what's your vision for combating climate change? Do you think there is a role for a public solution there, or is that does the market kind of need to deal with that?
So I think if you put the government in charge of something, you're going to get some very dismal results. And so why anybody would put the government in charge of something as important as the environment is confusing to me. Ultimately, as we've seen before, they tend to favor mega corporations. When government runs the land, like the federal government does a lot of land in the United States, it's not uncommon for them to lease that land to corporations, which then clear cut and strip mine and do all kinds of nasty things to it. The government's military is probably the worst polluter in the United States, worse than many of the corporate polluters combined. So these are not good stewards of the environment. One of the better ways to protect the environment is to protect property rights and make it so that if somebody's being polluted on their land or in their lungs or whatever, that they would have the ability to bring a tort and bring a case against whoever that polluter is, and that polluter should actually be held liable, unlike what we currently have with, let's say, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the BP oil spill, where the federal government protected BP from liability. They only had to pay out, I think it was like $75 million or something like that, way below what the actual cost of liability would have been for the destruction that they caused. So government ultimately ends up protecting their buddies and punishing their enemies, and we're not their buddies.
And when it comes to, something, I can see that kind of with specific instances of pollution, but something like carbon dioxide, climate change, where by the time we can, prove liability for a specific harm, it's already kind of too late. So is there, whether or not the government's a good steward of that, kind of what is the solution there, or what is the way to start addressing that?
Whatever it is, and I'm not going to claim to know, because I'm not an expert, but it would be voluntary. Whatever those solutions are, it would be through the marketplace, through consumer demand of saying, hey, we want these products to be more green. And we've certainly seen companies responding to that and promoting the various different ways that they're being environmentally responsible and all that. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that climate change is necessarily a bad thing or a thing that we're really creating. The climate probably changes over time anyway. And whether we have an influence on that or not, that's another question. If we do, again, creating government regulations isn't going to solve the problem, and creating a tax to pay the government more isn't going to, change how the earth behaves or the climate behaves. I don't think. Because government generally fails at everything they try to do.
So, since you have that viewpoint, so if New Hampshire were to secede from the Union, now it's its own
As it
state.
once did a long time ago.
Yeah, now it's its own state. Say it still has 1.2 million or so residents. How are they going to have any order?
What kind of order?
How are they going to decide how we protect this state? How are they going to decide about those few laws, like drunken driving laws, or protecting the general populace from ne'er-do-well?
So you've packed a lot into one question. There's the question of seceding from the United States, which could be done sooner rather than later without ending.
Right, but assuming
the state
that's
government.
already done, so
Right.
now you have your own entity.
Yeah.
And you
So
have,
the state government wouldn't necessarily have been abolished the next day, right? So
Right.
if the state government secedes from the United States, you still have the state of New Hampshire with whatever bureaucracies and things that it currently has. Then we talk about, replacing those bureaucracies with voluntary alternatives and consensual options. That's a process that, is, who knows how long that's going to take.
Okay, but eventually you're going to replace them with something.
Well, of
Right?
course,
It's not
somebody's
just
still
going to
got to
be
clear the roads.
1.2 million people who all just do their own thing and have no interaction and no common.
No, of course we have to
Goals.
interact with others. I mean, we're reliant on others to, provide services.
So then
to us.
there's going to be some form of government.
Well, you can
to
call
this
it whatever you want.
Well, that's what what I'm getting at
Yeah.
is you keep talking about how the government screws up everything it touches, and a lot of people feel that way. But you replace that, and then
Well, if they-
50 years later, are people going to be saying pretty much the same thing?
Hopefully not, because they would be voluntarily able to support these agencies. And if they're screwing up, then that's a good reason to support their competitor or to create another alternative. So the thing about the marketplace is when a service is being provided poorly or at a very high price, these are signals to people in the market saying, hey, there's money to be made if you can do a better job. And right now, the government, you can't compete with them in a lot of different ways. So allowing competition in the area of the roles that we've seen traditionally held as monopolies by the state would probably make it so the state, whatever that means in a voluntary society, would be more accountable because they could be held accountable beyond the account that we have right now, which is through the voting system, which is very inefficient and poor at holding government accountable. The much more accountable vote is to vote with your dollars and to be able to pull your dollars from an agency that isn't doing what you want them to do. That's how you get people to behave, and that's how you get them to be more efficient, is you get to be able to say no. And right now you don't have the freedom to say no to government.
Okay. One last thing. So assuming, again, that you were to actually take on the role of senator, and nobody was forcing you to pledge something you don't want to pledge, there's a sense for many people in this region that, and perhaps one or two others around the state, that most of the resources available in Concord go to the higher populated areas, and that maybe the Monadnock region gets short shrift on transportation dollars or whatever the various things are. Given that you'd be in place under the current governmental setup, is there a way you would try to work to ensure that this region got its fair share of resources?
Well, I mean, if we're still dealing with a situation where the resources are pooled into a central location in Concord and then distributed out arbitrarily by whatever political process, then yes, it would make sense to try to make that process as fair as possible. But the best way, of course, to distribute resources is to allow people to keep them themselves in the first place. Because when you decide how to spend your money, you're much better at it than, let's say, if you were to give me your money and maybe some instructions on how to spend it. I might do an okay job, but I'm probably not going to do as good as you. Further, if you were to give your money to a total stranger who doesn't really care what you say about how to do it, well, they're not going to do a better job than you at all. And further, if a group of strangers who's completely unaccountable takes your money by force, then they're not going to do a very good job with your money at all. So allowing the individual to decide how to allocate their own resources is the way for fair. That's the true fair distribution, right? Where you're not taking it from them by threat of force in the first place, and they get to decide. And that allows hopefully 1,000 flowers to bloom and different things to be created in the marketplace that may have not existed before.
All right.
I have one question.
Sure.
So, in New York State, for instance, there is an independent party with a capital I.
That's right.
But that doesn't mean you're a little I independent.
Correct.
Particularly if you have joined that party. So here there's a Libertarian Party, and you're running to represent it, but I'm quite struck by the difference between your approach to governing and, for instance, the party's gubernatorial candidate who was in here last week. So is that because there's just a wide gulf within the people who call themselves libertarians, little L?
Yeah.
And so what is your difference from the capital L Libertarian Party?
Sure. Good question. Technically, I am a member of the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, but I'm not a member of the National Libertarian Party because I don't want anything to do with those people. Principle to me matters, and I want to try to keep my message as principled as possible. And the principle that is, as I mentioned before, the non-aggression principle. So to try to tie everything back to the idea that the use of aggressive force always creates unintended consequences. Sure, you're going to get a school built if you steal enough money and throw it at a contractor. Sure, the government's going to get the roads done if they throw enough money at it. So it can get things done eventually. Of course, it's always behind budget. It's always over budget. It's always behind. So I want to keep on that message as much as possible. Others within the libertarian movement and that small L libertarian is a very wide movement, which includes people who might consider themselves more, let's say, small government. People that, either they personally haven't truly embraced the non-aggression principle, or maybe they're not comfortable. And I'm not speaking negatively towards Gilletta. I like Gilletta. She's great. I think she's a great candidate for governor. But maybe she, whether she has completely embraced that herself, I don't know. If she has, maybe she doesn't feel comfortable taking positions that would truly embrace that position, and wants to water down the ideas of liberty a little bit more, perhaps to make it more palatable to people, which is why I'm doing what I consider to be an informational campaign. I want people to know what the principle is. I want them to be able to analyze whether or not they agree with that principle, and then look at the issues and how it applies to those issues. I don't expect everybody to agree with me, and that's life. Not everybody's going to agree, and that's fine. But if I can get people thinking from a different perspective, or thinking about the issues from a different perspective, that's what's valuable to me.
Great, thank you.
Well, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me. It was a
Really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
I appreciate it.